Greetings, traveler of the void. You have entered the domain of void-born terrors. Before we begin, I want you to secure your Geller field. Like this archive, join the crew by subscribing to our channel and strike the bell of notification so that future transmissions reach you before the static swallows them whole. Now, turn down the lights and listen carefully, because what follows is not a story of monsters. Not precisely. It is something far older, far more Warhammer, and far more terrible than any demon with claws and a name. It is the story of a man with a clipboard, and a delivery that arrived precisely on schedule, and a regiment that had been waiting, in perfect order, standing at their posts, for 6 days after they had already died. This is Chapter 1, and the manifest is correct. I am recording this for procedural compliance, as I record all field entries. This is not a dramatic gesture. Provost-Scribes of the Departamento Munitorum, Grade 5 and above, are required by General Order 441 Kappa to maintain a continuous voice log during active planetary delivery operations. If anything, the drama would be paperwork, and paperwork, I have learned in 23 years, is never dramatic. It is simply there, like weather, like the recycled air in the cogitator bay that always tastes, no matter how many times I recalibrate the filters, faintly, of old parchment and warm machine oil, and something else I have never been able to name. My name is Aldric Haas. I am 54 years old. I have the distinct honor, and I use that word in the careful, technical sense that it deserves, of being the senior supply scribe aboard the Departamento Munitorum bulk freighter Ferrous Litany, vessel registration 7741, out of High Verigor, Ossuar IV. We have just completed warp transit and entered the upper atmosphere of Ossuar IV. Estimated time to landing site, 40 minutes. Our manifest for this delivery is as follows, and I will read it into the record in full as required. 86 pallets of Grade 3 compressed corpse starch ration bricks, individually vacuum sealed, with a shelf stability rating of 4 Terran years. 40 crates of dehydrated recaf powder, administratum standard grade, sufficient for 1,202 men for a period of 30 days at the rationed allocation of 1/4 cup per man per day. 12 Medici supply canisters containing field dressings, analgesic tablets, antitoxin ampules, and 2 units of Ossuan-grade blood volume substitute. 16 ceramic amphorae of distilled amasec, officer grade, sealed with the Aquila stamp of the Commissariat resupply pool. Total manifest weight, 341 tons. All items are present. All items have been weighed, counted, and cross-referenced against the outgoing manifest, filed at High Verigor 41 standard days ago. All items are correct. Destination, 701st Ossuar Fusiliers. Trench line Kappa, 7, grid reference 44 North, Ossuar IV. Scheduled delivery date, the 14th of Secundus. Today is the 14th of Secundus. The manifest is correct. I should note, for the log, for the record, for whoever processes these transcripts in the great halls of the administratum, where clerks far more important than me shuffle papers through eternity, that this delivery is 6 days late, not by any fault of mine. The delay was logged, stamped, and filed aboard this vessel at the commencement of warp transit, when Mistress Navigator Sepha Vaughan calculated an unforeseen variance in the current that added 6 days to our standard transit window. This is not unusual. Warp transit is, by its fundamental and terrible nature, imprecise. The variance has been recorded as a routine delay, subclassification, navigational, supplementary. Form 3 Theta has been filed. Everything is in order. I am noting this not because it concerns me. It is standard procedure. Deliveries run late. Regiments wait. This is the nature of supply work. We are the circulatory system of the Imperial war machine, and like all circulatory systems, we are subject to blockages, detours, and the occasional catastrophic variance that no one discusses in polite company. What matters is that we arrive, and we are arriving. The manifest is correct. That is what matters. Hour 4. Descent. Lower atmosphere. The ochre cloud layer of Ossuar IV has closed over us. Through the forward viewport of the Cogitator Bay, a narrow thing, barely 2 handspans wide, scratched by 3 decades of cargo runs and crusted at its edges with a mineral residue. I have been meaning to report to the maintenance pool for approximately 8 months. I can see the surface of Ossuar IV resolving from amber abstraction into something more specific. Ossuar IV is, by imperial classification, a Grade 3 agricultural world with secondary conscription designation. It grows things, or it did before the war came to it. What I can see from this viewport is not agricultural. It is geological in the way that wounds are geological. The ground has been turned over so many times, by boots and shells and the grinding teeth of siege machinery, that it has ceased to resemble earth and begun to resemble something closer to scar tissue, brown and grey and folded into itself in uneven ridges, crisscrossed by the geometry of defensive earthworks stretching toward the horizon. The smell is already present somehow, even sealed inside the hull. I know this is irrational. The atmospheric seals on a vessel of the Ferrous Litany's vintage are not perfectly airtight. She is a ship of 57 years, and her machine spirit, while loyal and hard-working, is the machine spirit of a woman who has walked very far and whose joints ache. But they should be sufficient to prevent atmospheric ingress at this altitude. And yet, the smell. It is not a battlefield smell, precisely. I have made 7 planetary deliveries to active war zones in my career, and I know what a battlefield smells like from the air. Promethium and burning. Cordite. The particular savory, terrible quality of things that were alive and are no longer. This is not that. This is something sweeter. Not pleasantly sweet. Sweetness in the wrong register, like sugar left too long in a warm place, and beginning its transformation into something else entirely. Something that smells of process rather than pleasure. I made a note of it in the supplementary environmental log. Subform 12 beta, atmospheric anomaly, non-tactical. It is probably nothing. Probably a local agricultural byproduct, some fermenting crop residue in the churned earth below. Probably. I am noting it because I note everything. That is my function. That is what I am. Hour 4. 30 minutes. Approach. I attempted to raise trench line Kappa 7 on the standard Munitorum supply vox frequency 11 minutes ago. This is standard procedure. Deliveries of this scale require a receiving party to confirm grid coordinates, confirm the identity of the accepting quartermaster, and provide landing guidance for the primary set-down zone. I have the frequency correct. I have triple-checked it against the manifest. The receiving frequency is listed clearly on line 47 of the delivery form, in the handwriting of the Kappa 7 Regiment's own requisitions officer, who submitted the resupply request 6 days ago from this date. The channel returned nothing. Not static. I want to be clear about this, because static is a documented phenomenon, with documented causes and documented remediation steps, all of which I could recite in my sleep and frequently do. In that half-waking state I occupy between sleeping and working, which has constituted my rest period for approximately 15 years. Static has texture. Static crackles and hisses, and contains within it the ghost signatures of distant transmissions, the cosmic background noise of the immaterium bleeding through the mundane frequencies of the materium. The channel returned none of that. It returned a quality of absence that I have no technical terminology for. The channel was open, confirmed open by the Vox panel's own indicator lumens, burning green. And through that open channel came the particular flavor of nothing that is different from static, in the way that a room with no one in it is different from a room with no one in it who is also holding their breath. I reported this to Mistress Navigator Vaughan. She was unconcerned. Vox silence on active war zone approaches is common, she said, without looking up from her helm charts. She has the posture of a woman who has spent 30 years communicating primarily with the machine spirits of very old ships, and who has gradually come to resemble them. Economy of movement, an expression of focused attention that borders on the devotional, hands that move across controls, with the certainty of someone who has learned not to hesitate because hesitation costs. Vox arrays take battle damage, she continued. Servitor relay stations go down. The frequency could be blocked by local ionization from the shelling. We have our grid coordinates. We have a landing window. The manifest demands delivery by the 14th. She glanced up. It is the 14th. She is correct. The manifest demands delivery by the 14th, and the manifest, as I have noted, is correct. I returned to the cogitator bay and I triple-checked the frequency. It was correct. I noted my unsuccessful contact attempt in the Vox log. Subform 7 Gamma, communication variance, receiving party non-responsive. I noted the time. I noted the frequency. I noted the signal quality. I noted the quality of the silence, though I did not have the proper terminology for it. So I wrote, in the notes field of subform 7 Gamma, channel open, no static, receiving party non-responsive, no structural interference detected. And then, in the small white space beneath that, which is technically designated for Scribe's personal notations, and which I have used in 23 years, perhaps 4 times. Something is wrong with the silence. I almost crossed it out. It is not a clerical notation. It is imprecise. It has no form number, but I left it. Hour 5, landing. The Ferris Litany set down at grid reference 44 north at 0900 hours, Ossuar local standard. The landing was uneventful in the technical sense. The ship's landing struts settled into the churned earth of the designated flat ground zone. The engine drone subsided to the grandmother's cough, as I have privately named it, and immediately felt embarrassed for having privately named it, because that is not a thing that a Provost-Scribe names. But here we are. And the hull groaned through its standard post-transit contraction as the temperature differential between the warp-warmed interior and the cold surface air of Ossuar IV did its slow arithmetic on 200 meters of aged imperial steel. I descended to the cargo hold. I verified the pallets. I checked the strapping on the Amasec amphorae. I retrieved my clipboard, my personal clipboard, which I have carried for 11 years and which has developed a slight warp along its left edge from the time I set it down on a heated plate in the galley of the throne's dividend and forgot it for 3 minutes. And I confirmed the manifest, top to bottom, one final time. 86 pallets, 40 crates, 12 canisters, 16 amphorae. Correct. I walked to the cargo ramp and I pressed the descent control. The ramp descended and the air of Ossuar IV came in. That smell, stronger now, that wrong sweetness beneath everything, beneath the expected compounds of a war zone, the promethium tang, the chemical bitterness of disturbed earth, the flat mineral taste of recycled moisture that had cycled through too many organisms before reaching the open air. Beneath all of that, that sweetness, that fermenting, patient, transforming sweetness. I stepped onto the ramp. The surface of Ossuar IV is grey-brown. The sky above it is the particular shade of amber that comes from a star being filtered through atmospheric particulate. The combined output of months of continuous artillery bombardment suspended in the upper air a permanent artificial twilight that turns the middle hours of the day into something resembling a very old pict capture with the color partially degraded. The light has no shadows exactly, because it comes from everywhere at once, filtered through that amber pall, so that everything is visible, and yet nothing has depth. The trench line of Kappa 7 was 40 meters from the landing zone, precisely as marked on the grid reference. A long earthwork, rising roughly chest height at its parapet, reinforced with sandbag stacks and irregular struts of salvaged metal sheeting. The wire before it, a double roll of barbed military wire, was intact, uncut, undisturbed, and above the parapet, above the chest-high earthwork, visible from 40 meters, visible from the top of the ramp against the amber sky, were the helmets, hundreds of them. The dull grey-green of Ossuar Fusilier standard issue, standing at the parapet in the posture of men on watch, evenly spaced, each one positioned above the rampart at exactly the correct height for a man standing on the firing step below. Hundreds of them, stretching left and right along the line of the trench, until the earthwork curved away in both directions, and the helmets disappeared into the amber haze. Perfectly still. Everyone. I felt something then. I want to be accurate about this for the log. It was not fear, not in the immediate sense. I am not a fighting man. Fear, for me, has a specific texture and register. It is the fear of a minor catastrophe that creates major paperwork, a dropped manifest, an unsigned form, a missing stamp. It is the administrative fear of a man who has built his safety out of procedure. What I felt on that ramp, looking at those perfect, motionless rows of helmets in the amber half-light, was something adjacent to fear, something I would describe, if pressed, as the sensation of a column of figures that does not add up, extended to the scale of the visible world. Something was wrong with the count. I picked up my clipboard. I picked up my quill. I began to walk down the ramp toward the trench. I called out a greeting. Hail, Verus Litany, Departamento Munitorum, Supply Division Tertius. We carry your scheduled resupply, manifest number. Not one helmet turned. I was 20 meters from the parapet now. 10. 5. I could see clearly over the lip of the sandbags. I could see the faces beneath the helmets. They were standing at their posts. They were holding their laser guns. They were, all of them, looking out at the wire with the particular focused patience of soldiers who have been given an order and are waiting for it to change. They were all dead. I stopped. I looked at my manifest. The manifest was correct. The manifest said 1,202 enlisted men, 44 officers, 700 1st Ossuar Fusiliers, alive and operational, awaiting resupply at trench line Kappa 7. Grid reference 44 North. I looked up from the manifest. I looked at the dead. I opened the notes field of subform 7 Gamma, communication variance, receiving party non-responsive, and I wrote, in the small space beneath my earlier notation, receiving party located. Receiving party is non-responsive. I paused. Then I wrote, discrepancy identified. Traveler of the Void, you have completed the first transmission. If the Geller field held, if the dread has settled into your bones as it should, then secure it further. Strike the seal of approval upon this chronicle, so that the Emperor may witness it. Join the crew by subscribing to the Voidborn Terrors Archive, and strike the bell of notification, so that the next transmission finds you before the silence does. Chapter 2. Outstanding Requisitions. I have been a clerk for 23 years. In those 23 years I have processed 11,412 individual supply manifests. I have cross-referenced cargo weights against declared tolerances on worlds whose names I can no longer remember. I have reconciled discrepancies between outgoing forms and receiving acknowledgements across 6 subsectors, in holds that smelled of machine oil and recycled breath, and the particular stale warmth of cargo that has been in transit too long. I have done all of this without ever once seeing a battlefield. I am telling you this because I want the record to reflect that what I did next was not stupidity. It was not a failure of imagination. It was the only framework I possessed for processing what stood before me. I opened my manifest, and I began to count. The trench proper was accessed through a timber-framed entry cut in the parapet wall, approximately 12 meters to my left, a standard Munitorum regulation approach gap, wide enough for a laden servitor trolley. The wood of the frame was dark with absorbed moisture, and something else, a slow seep of fluid I did not examine closely. I stepped through. The interior of the trench was exactly what the schematics had promised. A regulation defensive earthwork, 1.8 meters deep at the firing step, 2.2 meters at the communications channel running behind it. The duckboards were intact. Old timber, swollen with damp, but unbroken. The sandbag walls were solid. The reinforcing struts showed no battle damage, no scorch from last fire, no craters from ballistic impact, no evidence of the kind of systematic structural violation that occurs when a trench line is overrun. The trench had not been fought over. That was the first impossibility. A regiment does not die to a man in a defensive position without leaving the marks of its dying on the position itself. There should have been burn scoring on the parapet, spent casings in the mud, shell craters in the earthwork, evidence of the particular brutal physics of men fighting for their ground. There was none of that. The trench was pristine. The trench was exactly as it should have been at the beginning of a watch. Everything in its correct place, every man at his correct station, the entire machinery of the defensive line arranged in perfect order. The men simply were not breathing. I began with the nearest soldier. He was standing on the firing step, back against the rear wall of the trench, laser gun angled across the parapet in the approved watchman's ready position. His eyes were open. They were the eyes of a man looking at something in the middle distance, not glazed, not rolled back, simply oriented outward at the wire and the grey-brown nothing beyond it with an expression of flat, patient attention, as though whatever he was watching was not yet interesting but might become so. His skin had a quality I noted without being able to name properly in any form I carried. Not pale in the way of cold or shock, a pallor that came from beneath rather than from the surface, a kind of waxy translucency, as if the tissue had been slowly, evenly compressed from the inside, squeezing the color down into the deeper architecture of the flesh and leaving only this careful, muted exterior. His uniform was dry. His boots were dry. There was no mud on him, though the trench floor was thoroughly muddied. He had been standing on the firing step for long enough that whatever mud had been on his boots had dried and fallen away. 6 days. The thought landed in my mind with the flat thud of a ledger book dropped on a stone floor. The particular state of him, the compression, the pallor, the dried mud, spoke of 6 days, not 6 hours, not overnight. 6 days standing at his post in the amber half-light of Ossuar IV, while the ration delivery that never came sat in the hold of the Ferris Litany 6 days behind schedule. I checked his dog tag. I found the name in my manifest. The full regimental roster is always carried as Appendix 7 of a delivery manifest, because receiving acknowledgement requires matching the quartermaster's signature against the personnel record to verify command authority. I found him on page 31 of Appendix 7. I made a small tick beside his name. I moved to the next man. An hour. That is how long it took me to process the first 100. I want to be precise about my mental state during that hour, because the log is a document, and documents must be precise. I was not numb. Numbness implies the absence of feeling, and I was not absent from what I was doing. I was, in the clinical sense, dissociating, which is to say I was filing, I was processing, I was moving through the trench with my clipboard and my quill, and I was ticking names against the roster in Appendix 7, and I was doing this because it was the only response to the situation that lay within my competence and my authority. A Provost-Scribe does not investigate. A Provost-Scribe does not fight. A Provost-Scribe does not call for reinforcement, because the Vox is silent, and the Ferris Litany carries a crew of 9, and none of them are soldiers. A Provost-Scribe accounts. A Provost-Scribe reconciles the numbers. A Provost-Scribe makes sure the columns add up. So I counted. I counted through the main firing trench. I counted through the communications channel running behind it. I found a cluster of bodies, 8 of them, in a supply alcove that had been converted into an informal mess station. Recaf cups still on the rough-hewn shelf, one cup knocked onto its side with its contents dried to a dark ring on the timber beneath. They were seated at the bench in the postures of men taking a rest break, elbows on the table, some with their hands still loosely wrapped around their cups. The expression on each face was the same as the one on the watchman, that flat, patient outward look, as though they were all watching for the same thing, as though they were all waiting for a delivery that had been 6 days late in arriving. The smell was strongest in the alcove, that sweetness. It lived in the enclosed space, thick as cloth, and underneath it something else had begun to assert itself. The iron and copper note that the body makes when its long work is finally unwinding. I breathed through my mouth. I checked the dog tags. I ticked the names. By the time I reached the communications trench junction that led to the command dugout, I had accounted for 611 of the regiment's 1,202 enlisted strength, all present, all dead, all in their correct positions. The command dugout was built into the rear wall of the trench, reinforced with corrugated metal sheeting and heavy timber bulks. The door, a salvaged hatch, rehinged, was closed but unlatched. I pushed it open. Inside, maps spread across a folding table with the casual permanence of documents that have been in use for long enough that no one bothers to roll them anymore. A Vox station, its indicator lumens still burning faint amber. 3 fold-out chairs, one occupied. A single lumen strip along the ceiling, its machine spirit guttering in long, slow pulses. On for 3 seconds, dimming for 2, brightening again. The rhythm of a light that has been running without maintenance for longer than it was designed to. The officer at the chair was the regiment's senior quartermaster. I identified him by his rank pip and by the nameplate on his desk rather than by his dog tag, because he was seated facing the table, and I did not disturb him. He had died over his paperwork. His chin was resting on his forearms, which were folded on the table's surface in a posture that might, at a distance, have suggested sleep. The papers beneath his arms were spread in working order. Supply requests, delivery acknowledgements, inter-unit transfer forms. The pen had fallen from his hand and rolled to the table's edge, where it had stopped, balanced precisely at the lip, as though it too were waiting. I stood in the doorway of the command dugout for what the log tells me was 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I noted the time on entry and the time I began moving again, and the difference was 4 minutes. I do not know what I was doing in those 4 minutes in any meaningful sense. Processing, I suppose. Reconciling. Then I saw what was on the table, beneath the dead quartermaster's outstretched arm. I had to ease the papers out carefully, because his weight was on them, and I did not wish to disturb the arrangement. The papers came free slowly. the way papers do when they have been in contact with a surface long enough to take on a slight adhesion. They were Departamento Munitorum Form 7 Sigma, Resupply Request, Forward Tactical. Standard form, I know every line of it without looking, because I have processed more Form 7 Sigmas than I have processed any other document in my career, and it has the particular familiarity of something seen so often that it has ceased to have edges, like a word repeated until it becomes only sound. The form was complete, every field filled, in the neat abbreviated hand of a regimental administrator who had been trained to compress information into small spaces. Unit designation, grid reference, supply category, quantity requested, receiving officer's name and rank, date of submission. The unit seal was present in the bottom left corner, the brass stamp impression of the 701st Ossuar Fusiliers, an image of a shovel crossed with a bayonet above the regimental number, pressed into the form in the regulation blue-black ink.
I read the date of submission.
I read it again. I set down my clipboard. I picked it back up. I found the delivery manifest. My manifest. The one I had carried from High Verigor. The one I had checked 11 times during transit, and once again this morning, before descending the ramp. I found line 47, where the original resupply request reference was cited. The Form 7 Sigma I was holding was the original resupply request, the one that had generated my delivery, the one that, when it was processed by the Administratum Relay at High Verigor, had produced the delivery order that had put the Ferrer's Litany in the air and put 86 pallets of corpse starch and 40 crates of recaf into her hold. It had been submitted 8 days ago. The regiment had been dead, by every physical indication available to me. A man who is emphatically not a physician, but who can read the state of preserved flesh with the same methodical accuracy he reads any other document, for at least 6 days. The form had been submitted 8 days ago. 2 days before they died, this dead quartermaster had sat at this table and filled out the form requesting the delivery I had just brought to his door. He had filled it out and stamped it and submitted it through the regimental vox relay to the administratum at High Verigor, and the administratum had processed it. Processed it, I knew, because I had the delivery order that processing had produced. And then 6 days had passed, and the delivery had been late, and the regiment had died, and the form had been here on the table the entire time, waiting for confirmation. The transaction was open. The supply request had been submitted. The delivery had been made, but the delivery had not been received. The loop had not closed. The account was outstanding. I stood in the lumen strip's guttering light. 3 seconds bright, 2 seconds dim, 3 seconds bright. And I held both documents, one in each hand, and I experienced the specific variety of horror that belongs only to a certain kind of mind. The horror of a discrepancy that is internally consistent. Both documents were correct. Both were in order. The numbers simply did not reconcile with the physical state of the world. Something had been counting the same way I was counting, and it had found the same error. I am not certain how much time passed after that. The log stamp shows approximately 40 minutes between my last notation and what I am about to record, and I have no memory of those 40 minutes that I can reconstruct with any confidence. I believe I was still in the command dugout. I believe I was sitting in the chair opposite the dead quartermaster, because that is where I found myself when the sound brought me back. The Vox station. Its indicator lumens were still burning amber. The handset was still in its cradle. The sound was coming from the handset, not static. I want to be precise about this, because static is explicable. The handset was producing a transmission, live, clear, the carrier frequency holding steady without degradation. My own voice, my greeting, the one I had delivered at the trench lip. Hail, Ferrer's Litany, Departamento Munitorum, Supply Division Tertius, we carry your scheduled resupply, was playing back through the Vox handset with a faint delay, as though the sound had taken 40 minutes to travel 40 meters, as though the air of Ossuar IV, or whatever now moved through it, had caught the words in transit and was only now letting them arrive. I listened to my own voice complete the greeting that I had spoken outside an hour ago. Then the greeting ended, and the channel did not return silence. Through the handset, through the open, steady, amber-lit frequency of the regimental Vox station in the command dugout of a regiment that had been dead for 6 days, came breathing. Not my breathing. I checked. I held my breath. The breathing on the channel continued, slow, measured, patient. The breathing of something that had no need to rush, because it was not going anywhere, because it had been here for 6 days already, and it would remain here for however many days it took for the paperwork to be resolved. Because the account was outstanding, because the file was open, and somewhere beneath the duck boards of trench line Kappa 7, something was still counting. Traveler of the Void, the second transmission is complete. The manifest brought Aldric Haas to the trench. The trench held its dead in perfect order. And now, from below the earth, something has confirmed his arrival. It knows he is here. It knows he was not on the original manifest. Chapter 3 awaits. Form 9 Alpha. Accounting for discrepancies. Aldric will go deeper into the trench, and he will find the one thing more terrible than a regiment of the dead. A single survivor who is already filing paperwork for a future that has not yet occurred. If the dread has found its way into your chest, secure it there. Strike the seal of approval on this chronicle. Join the crew. Strike the bell. The file is open. The account is outstanding. Come back for Chapter 3. Chapter 3. Form 9. Alpha. Accounting for discrepancies. I replaced the Vox handset in its cradle. I did this carefully, deliberately, with the particular deliberateness of a man who understands that how you handle a document, how you set it down, how you close the file, how you replace the stylus in its holder when you are finished, is not mere habit, but a form of assertion, a statement that the world is still ordered. Those actions still have correct and incorrect forms, that I am still a Provost-Scribe, Grade 7, Departamento Munitorum, and not simply a soft-handed man of 54, standing in a trench full of the dead, on a planet that smells of sweetness and wrong. The breathing on the channel stopped when I replaced the handset. Whether it stopped because I replaced the handset, or whether it simply stopped at that moment by coincidence, I cannot determine from the available evidence. I noted both possibilities in subform 12 beta, atmospheric anomaly, non-tactical, under the expanded field heading I had by that point redesignated, anomaly, unclassified, pending further investigation. I then sat in the command dugout for what the log shows was 11 minutes, during which I completed the count. I had the full roster in Appendix 7. I had ticked, by that point, 611 names in the firing trench and the communications channel. The command dugout contained 7 officers, including the quartermaster, all accounted for, which meant the remaining 584 personnel of the 701st Ossuar Fusiliers were distributed through the secondary trench network. The reserve bays, the supply alcoves, the rest bunkers, the latrine channels, the ammunition transfer corridors that branched off the main line at regulation intervals. All of them were here. The regiment had not broken, had not run, had not even, so far as I could determine from the evidence available, attempted to. That, I realized, sitting in the guttering light of the command dugout with the dead quartermaster's pen balanced at the table's edge before me. was the most terrible thing about the count so far. A regiment of 1,246 souls does not die in perfect order. Not in battle. In battle, men scatter. They fall forward or backward. They die reaching for something, or running from something, or turning toward the sound of a voice. Battle leaves its disorder written on the bodies of those who did not survive it. The twisted postures, the desperate last positions, the evidence of a living thing that was interrupted mid-action by the fact of its ending. These men had not been interrupted. They had simply concluded. As though the process of being a soldier, of standing at the parapet, of sitting at the mess bench, of sleeping in the bunk, had run its complete course and reached its natural terminus, and they had stopped, each of them, at the precise moment their function was complete, like a machine whose task is finished and whose machine spirit has simply ceased to draw power. I noted this in the log. I noted it under the heading I had created, Anomaly, Unclassified, and I wrote, personnel disposition consistent with orderly cessation rather than violent termination. No evidence of external cause. Discrepancy between physical state and submitted paperwork remains unresolved. Then I stood up. I picked up my clipboard, and I went deeper into the trench. The secondary network branched off the main communications channel through a series of reinforced archways cut into the earth and faced with prefabricated Munitorum issue retention panels. The grey, slightly textured composite sheeting that the Departamento uses for semi-permanent field structures, stamped at intervals with the aquila and a batch number, and the reminder that this material is the property of the Imperium of Man and must be returned to the issuing depot upon conclusion of operations. I have always found some comfort in that stamp. The Imperium asking for its panels back. The bureaucratic assertion that even the materials of war are accounted for. That nothing is simply consumed and forgotten. That somewhere in a depot on a world I will never visit, a clerk like me is waiting for the panels to come home. That comfort was thinner than usual, walking through the secondary trench network of Kappa 7. The sound beneath the duckboards had begun. Not the breathing from the Vox station, that had been directional, contained, mediated through the machine of the Vox itself. This was different. This came from below, from the earth beneath the treated timber of the duckboards, from the densely packed soil beneath the trench floor, that the Fusiliers had been standing on for however many months this position had been held. A low, resonant hum, not mechanical, not the machine spirit hum of a generator or a pump, but something organic in its rhythm, something that rose and fell with a patience that made the chest tight, because patience of that quality implies a very long wait, and a very long wait implies that whatever is waiting has every reason to believe it will eventually be satisfied. I kept walking. I ticked names. I catalogued the distribution of the dead through the secondary network with the same methodical progression I had used in the main trench. Reserve Bay Alpha, 43 personnel, all present, all consistent with the cessation pattern I had noted in the main line. Reserve Bay Beta, 31 personnel, plus a field shrine to the Emperor, a small alcove cut into the earth, a pressed tin aquila nailed to the soil wall, 2 candles burned entirely to their bases, the wax pooled and hardened on the shelf below them in shapes that I spent more time examining than I should have, because they seemed to have hardened into something other than random pooling, some arrangement that my pattern-reading mind kept trying to resolve into numerals. I looked away from the wax. I ticked the names. It was in the 4th supply alcove of the secondary network, designated on the regimental schematic, which I had taken from the command dugout as Storage Bay D4, that I found the second form 7 Sigma, and then the 3rd, and then the 4th. There were 11 of them, stacked on the supply shelf with the careful ordering of documents that someone had intended to file. Each one was a Departamento Munitorum resupply request, Form 7 Sigma, filled out in the same abbreviated regimental administrator hand as the one I had found on the quartermaster's desk. Each one bore the unit seal of the 701st Ossuar Fusiliers. Each one listed the standard resupply categories: corpse starch rations, recaf, medici canisters, amasec for the officer caste, in the standard quantities for a regiment of this size. Each one was dated. The dates ran in sequence. The first, the one I already had from the quartermaster's desk, was dated 8 days ago. The next in the stack was dated 6 weeks from today. The one after that, 6 weeks beyond that. All the way through to the 11th form, which was dated approximately 16 months from this morning. 16 months of future resupply requests, filled out and ready to submit, stacked in a supply alcove by a regiment that had been dead for 6 days. I sat down on an ammunition crate. I sat there for what the log shows was 7 minutes. I was aware during those 7 minutes of the hum beneath the duckboards. Present here too, perhaps slightly stronger, slightly more resolved, as though the earth beneath this alcove was vibrating at a frequency closer to something I could almost hear as sound rather than sensation. I was aware of the amber half-light filtering down through the gaps in the overhead cover. I was aware of the smell, that sweet fermenting quality now carrying something sharper beneath it, something that reminded me, absurdly, of the cogitator bay on the Ferris Litany on a warm transit, when the machine oil heated and thinned, and the whole bay smelled briefly of hot metal and the ghost of older heat. I picked up the stack of forms. I examined each one. I was looking for the thing that would make them explicable. A date error, a clerical repetition, a training exercise in form completion that some over-thorough regimental administrator had prepared months in advance and simply never filed. I found none of those things. The forms were individually completed. Each had minor variations in the specific quantities requested, the kind of variations that reflect actual assessment of current stock levels rather than rote duplication. Whoever filled these out had thought about them, had looked at the shelves, counted the remaining supplies, and calculated what would be needed and when. The regiment had been planning for a future that, by the time I arrived, they no longer had. And in the planning for that future, in the careful, procedurally correct act of submitting their resupply requests through the proper channels, they had fed the accounting. They had kept the transaction alive. They had ensured that for the next 16 months, some version of the Ferris Litany would be dispatched to grid reference 44 North with a hold full of corpse starch and recaf. And something down here, below the duckboards, was counting on it. The Commissar's personal log was in the breast pocket of the Commissar himself, who I found in Reserve Bay Alpha, seated against the earthwork wall, with his bolt pistol still holstered, and his hands resting on his knees in a posture of complete composure. He was a compact man, with the kind of face that has been weathered into useful severity. Not cruel, not soft, simply functional. A face for giving orders that would be obeyed because the alternative was not worth considering. His personal log was a small leather-bound volume, privately ciphered in the manner of commissariat officers, who are trained to assume that anything they write may one day be read by an enemy, and who therefore develop private notation systems that resemble, to the untrained eye, elaborate shorthand about supply schedules. It took me 50 minutes to break the cipher. I will not pretend that 50 minutes was a long time for this work. I have broken commissariat cipher notation before, because in 23 years of supply work, you encounter the paperwork of dead officers with some regularity, and the commissariat uses a rotating substitution cipher with a regimental date key that is, once you know to look for it, no more difficult than a moderately challenging cogitator puzzle. What I found inside was not his supply schedules. His name was Breck. He had held command authority over the 701st for 4 years. He wrote with the compressed precision of a man who has been trained to say exactly what he means and no more. And reading his personal log was like reading a document that had been stripped of everything that wasn't load-bearing. The early entries were tactical, movement orders, discipline citations, the routine notation of an officer managing a regiment on a war zone. Then, approximately 9 days ago, 1 day before the resupply form was submitted, 2 days before the deaths, the entries changed. I will transcribe them here into this log for the record. Day 1. Sound reported below the firing trench. Private Wes, D4 sector, claims it began after the delivery failed to arrive, dismissed as environmental. Ossuar substrate is partially mineralized clay known to produce settlement noise under load. No action required. Day 2. Sound persists. The character has changed, no longer consistent with substrate settlement. Rhythm suggests, I am recording this precisely as I observe it, rhythm suggests counting. Individual pulse beats, evenly spaced, in sequences that Sergeant Murr, who was a numbers man before conscription, identifies as ascending. Someone is counting up. From what number, toward what total, remains unclear. Sleep is difficult. The men are not speaking about it, which is worse than if they were. Day 3. Resupply form submitted by Quartermaster Edris as scheduled. I authorize the submission. Perhaps the arrival of the delivery will resolve the, I do not have a word for this, the disruption. The men call it the auditor. I have not corrected them. The naming of a thing is a kind of management. Day 4. 3 men in Bay Alpha report that they cannot determine how long they have been on watch. The time, they say, feels contested, as though something is reviewing it. I have assigned the regimental confessor to lead the litanies of duration, the old watch prayers, the ones that mark the hours. The chanting helps. While it continues, the counting below seems to pause. Day 5. The confessor's voice gave out in the 2nd hour of the night watch. The counting resumed within minutes of his silence. I attempted to lead the litanies myself. I am not a praying man in the devotional sense, but I understand the function of ritual. It is a form of paperwork, a declaration to whatever is listening that the accounting is current, that we are here, that we are accounted for. The counting paused again. I maintained the litanies until I could not. The delivery has not arrived. The account is open. I believe, and I am recording this because I am a commissar, and it is my function to record what I believe regardless of how it sounds, that the entity below is not interested in us as prey. It is interesting to us as an outstanding item, a transaction that has not been confirmed. It will hold the account open until the accounting closes. The delivery must arrive. The resupply must be received. The form must be signed and stamped and confirmed through proper channels. That is all it requires. That is all any of them require. The Emperor preserve us. The litanies are failing. I can feel it counting me. The final entry was a single line, written in a hand slightly less controlled than the preceding pages. Day 6. It has finished counting. It knows the number. The Emperor forgive the administratum. I closed the log. I sat with it in my hands in Reserve Bay Alpha, in the amber half-light, with the dead Commissar Breck beside me, and the hum rising slow and patient through the duckboards beneath my feet. And then, from the far end of the secondary trench network, from the deepest reach of the storage corridor that the regimental schematic designated as D4, the same alcove where I had found the 11 Form 7 Sigmas, came a sound. Not the hum, not the breathing I had heard on the Vox. Something else. something that had the rhythm of human speech without any of its content. A voice, moving through syllables in a cadence I recognized before I could name it, because I had heard it in the cogitator bay of the Ferris Litany on long transits, when I worked through the small hours and the rest of the crew slept, and the only sound was the grandmother's cough of the engines, and my own voice murmuring the names on the manifest, cross-referencing, confirming, ticking off the living against the ledger of the expected. Someone was reading a roster. I picked up my clipboard. I picked up my lumen. I walked toward the sound. In the storage alcove of D4, jammed between a stack of empty ammunition crates and the earth wall, knees pulled to her chest and hands pressed flat against her sternum, was a fusilier, a woman, alive. I could see the movement of breathing, the slow rise and fall of the rib cage, the faint condensation of breath in the alcove's cold air. Her eyes were open. Her jaw was moving. Her eyes did not track me when I entered, did not blink at the lumen, did not register my presence with any of the ordinary responses of a living person who has been found. She was reading the roster. Not from a document, from memory. Every name in the regiment, in order, in the flat recitative of a clerk doing inventory. I stood and I listened, and I followed the names against Appendix 7 in my own manifest, checking them off as she spoke them, because I could not stop myself, because it was the only response I had. She was correct. Every name, in exact regimental order, without error, without pause. In her hands, pressed to her sternum, was a piece of paper. I reached down carefully and angled my lumen to read it without removing it from her grip. It was a Form 7 Sigma, a resupply request, dated 6 days from today, filled out in her hand, signed, stamped, ready to submit. I straightened. I looked at her jaw, still moving through the names. I found her in Appendix 7. She was near the end of the roster, the Q's and R's of the enlisted. Junior Quartermaster Corporal Vess, T assigned to D4 sector, 22 years old. She was on page 47 of Appendix 7. She was accounted for. She was still here. And the thing beneath the duckboards was still counting, and it had just gotten to the name at the end of the list that did not belong there. Mine, Traveler of the Void. The third transmission is complete. Aldric Haas has the dead commissar's log. He has the future resupply forms. He has the name for what is in the trench, the auditor, and he understands now what it wants. He has found Corporal Vess, alive, counting the dead. And the hum beneath the boards has just found an unaccounted name on its ledger, his. Chapter 4 awaits. Final Audit. The auditor's architecture will be fully revealed, and Aldric will discover that the only solution available to him is one that the Administratum will never allow. Secure the Geller field, strike the seal, join the crew, strike the bell. The account is outstanding, the file is open. Come back for Chapter 4. Chapter 4. Final Audit. I pulled up an ammunition crate and I sat down beside Corporal Vess. Not because I had a plan. Not because proximity to a living person, the only living person I had found in 4 hours of counting the dead, offered any tactical advantage. A concept I am in any case entirely unqualified to assess. I sat beside her because my legs had decided, with the quiet authority of a body that has been ignored for too long, that the standing portion of this particular situation was concluded. She continued her recitation. The names came in the same flat, precise cadence, unhurried, unbroken. The full regimental roster, cycling through from the beginning again, because she had reached the end and simply returned to the start without pause, the way a servitor cycles back through its programmed loop when the task queue empties. I sat with my clipboard across my knees and my lumen wedged between the crate and the earth wall. casting its thin light across the alcove, and I listened to her count the dead. The hum beneath the duckboards had changed, not louder precisely, more present. The distinction matters, and I will try to be accurate about it. Volume is a property of sound in space, a measure of the energy a sound contains. What changed in the hum was not its energy, but its attention. It had the quality of a thing that has been performing a background operation for a very long time, and has just returned a result. A cogitator that has finished processing and is now waiting for input. The hum had been searching. Now it has found something. Me. I know how that reads in a log. I know how the mind of whoever reviews this transcript, some administratum archivist in a well-lit room in a world where the earth does not hum, will process that sentence. I am aware that the hum found me is not a standard evidentiary claim. I am a Provost-Scribe. I deal in verifiable quantities, weights, counts, dates, signatures. I do not deal in the quality of silences or the attention of sounds. But I have 23 years of reading documents, and a document that has been read, that has had attention turned upon it, has a different quality from one that sits unexamined. Any clerk who has ever retrieved a file from an archive shelf and felt, in the moment of opening it, that it was waiting for exactly this, knows what I mean. The hum had found me the way a file is found. It had located the discrepancy. It knew I was unaccounted for. I opened Commissar Breck's personal log to the final entry. I read it again. Emperor, forgive the administratum. I turned to a fresh page in the back of the log. He had left several blank, and I began to write. Not because I believed writing would help, because I am what I am, and what I am writes things down. What follows is my reconstruction of the nature of the entity I am designating, for record purposes, as the auditor, a name I have inherited from the men who named it before me and did not survive the naming. I base this reconstruction on 3 sources: the Commissar's cipher log, the physical evidence of the trench, and 11 Form 7 Sigmas filed against a future that the filers would not inhabit. The auditor is not a demon. I want to establish this clearly, because the word demon carries with it a specific theological and tactical framework that does not apply here. A demon is a creature of the 4 ruinous powers. It has allegiance, motivation, a patron, a purpose that maps onto the great cosmic conflicts of the immaterium. The Commissar in his log was careful to note this distinction. The auditor predates the ruinous powers, or at least predates their dominion over this particular corner of the warp. It is something older, something that emerged not from the worship of dark gods, but from the collective psychic weight of a different human experience entirely. 10,000 years of Imperium, 10,000 years of men and women being counted, sorted, assigned, catalogued, conscripted, tithed, and processed by a bureaucratic machine so vast and so indifferent that it has, in the great calculus of the immaterium, where all human feeling eventually accretes into form, generated its own entity. Not a god, not even a demon in the proper sense. A reflex, a process that has become self-aware in the way that a current becomes a river. Not through intention, but through accumulated force, through the sheer volume of human psychic energy poured into the experience of being accounted for and found wanting. The auditor does not want souls. It has no interest in suffering as currency. The ruinous powers are sustained by emotion, rage, despair, excess, change. The auditor is sustained by something far more mundane and far more terrible. It is sustained by open transactions, by outstanding accounts, by the specific psychic resonance of a thing that has been requested and not delivered, a form that has been submitted and not confirmed, a ledger entry that has no closing line. It finds these open accounts the way water finds low ground, not by searching, but by flowing toward the path of least resistance, toward the places in the immaterium where the pressure of unresolved bureaucratic obligation has thinned the membrane between the warp and the material world to the point of permeability. The 701st Ossuar Fusiliers had been holding their position for months. They had been filing resupply requests through the proper channels with the regular diligence of a regiment that does things correctly, because correct procedure is what keeps a regiment alive in the long, mean stretch between battles. And their quartermaster, the dead man at the desk, pen fallen to the table's edge, had understood this with the bone-deep conviction of a man who has seen what happens to units that let their paperwork slip. And then the delivery failed to arrive, and the account had opened, and the auditor had come up through the earth, drawn by the specific psychic frequency of 1,246 people experiencing the same sensation simultaneously. The sensation of waiting for something that has been promised and has not come. It moved through the trench, the commissar's log said, without touching anyone. It did not need to touch anyone. It only needed to count. And counting, the auditor's counting, is not a passive observation. It is a process that interacts with its subject. It moves through a living person the way an audit moves through a ledger, examining every entry, validating every claim, looking for the line that doesn't balance. The men of the 701st were on the manifest. They were present. They were accounted for. But they were present in a location that had an outstanding supply request. A request that said, in the precise formal language of the Departamento Munitorum, that this unit required resources in order to continue existing. And those resources had not arrived, which meant that the unit's continued existence was, in bureaucratic terms, operating on credit that had not been extended. The auditor found the discrepancy, and it held the account open, and it waited. The men died waiting. Not from violence, not from the auditor's direct action. It did not kill them, in the way that a storm does not kill by choosing to. They died the way a process that has been suspended dies. They simply stopped mid-operation, because the operation could not continue without the outstanding resource. They starved, in a sense. Not of food. There were still rations in the supply alcoves, untouched, because eating required the future, and the auditor's hold on the account had done something to their experience of the future, had made it contingent, conditional, dependent on the resolution of the outstanding transaction. You cannot eat a meal that is funded by an account that has been frozen pending audit. They died in their positions because their positions were their function, and their function could not advance without the resupply, and the resupply had not come, and the auditor had waited, patient as paper, certain as a stamp, because it knew with the serene confidence of a process rather than a creature that the delivery would eventually arrive. The form had been submitted. The administratum had processed it. Somewhere in the vast grinding machinery of the Departamento Munitorum, a delivery order had been generated and assigned and loaded and dispatched. The delivery would come, and when it came, someone would be there to receive it. Someone would be on the manifest. Someone would close the account. The hum shifted. Not a change in the sound itself, in its pitch or rhythm, or the physical quality of its resonance through the duckboard timber. A change in its direction. It had been general before, present throughout the floor of the alcove, a rising quality in the earth beneath my feet, as though the soil itself was vibrating sympathetically with something far below. Now it has a vector. It was coming from the north end of the D4 storage corridor, the deep end, the end that abutted the furthest reach of the secondary trench network before the earthwork simply terminated in solid ground. Something was moving, not walking. The duckboards produced no footfall. I could hear no displacement of the mud and mineral water that collected between the boards and the trench floor, moving the way that pressure moves through a medium, the way sound moves, a wave rather than a body. Beside me, Corporal Vess stopped reciting. The silence that replaced her voice was total, in a way that silence in an occupied space never is. In an occupied space, even in a space occupied only by the dead and myself, there are micro sounds, the settling of materials, the slight friction of clothing against skin with each breath, the tiny mechanical sounds of a body performing its autonomic functions without permission. Corporal Vess's silence was not the silence of a person who has stopped speaking. It was the silence of a record that has been paused. Everything about her had simply ceased to produce sound. Her eyes moved. That was the only motion. The rest of her remained fixed, knees to chest, hands flat against the Form 7 Sigma at her sternum, jaw no longer moving, chest still breathing in those shallow metronomic intervals that were the only evidence she remained alive. But her eyes moved. They turned toward the north end of the corridor, toward the source of the hum, with the slow tracking motion of a picked recorder following a moving subject. I did not turn. I am recording this accurately. I did not turn to look at the north end of the corridor. I kept my eyes on Corporal Vess, and I kept my quill moving across the page of the Commissar's log, writing down what I understood, because the alternative to writing was the particular failure of nerve that I have spent 23 years constructing my professional identity in opposition to. Provost scribes do not fail. They document. I wrote, "The auditor is present in the corridor. I have not looked at it directly. I am constructing my understanding of it from available evidence and the Commissar's prior testimony." I wrote, "The Commissar described it as a column of figures that has learned to stand upright." I wrote, "I believe this is accurate. I believe that if I turn and look at it, I will see something that my mind will attempt to resolve into a shape that makes sense and fail, and the failure will be the beginning of the kind of psychological dissolution that ends with a man standing at a parapet with his eyes fixed on the middle distance, counting the same thing over and over until he stops." I wrote, "I am not going to look at it." I wrote, "I am going to look at it." And I looked. I will not describe it completely. Not because the words don't exist. I am a man of words, a man of documents, a man who has spent his career believing that with sufficient precision of language, anything can be accurately recorded. But because I have thought carefully about the function of this log, about who will read it, and what purpose its reading will serve, and I have concluded that a complete description of the auditor serves no one, and may in fact serve the thing itself. I will say this. The Commissar was correct. It had the quality of figures, of numbers arranged vertically, of a column of data that has become structural, that has taken on, in the immaterium's particular alchemy of psychic energy and accumulated belief, the capacity to occupy space. It was tall in the way that a document stack is tall, not through any internal aspiration toward height, but through the simple accumulation of layer upon layer, each one resting on the last, the whole thing coherent only because the layers are consistent. It had no face in any meaningful sense, but it had the place where a face would be, and in that place was the particular quality of attention I had felt in the hum, that focused procedural awareness of a process directed at a specific input. It was looking at me the way an auditor looks at a line item that doesn't belong in the ledger it's reviewing. It was not hostile. I want to record this clearly, because hostile implies motivation, and motivation implies a perspective, and the auditor had no perspective, any more than a set of scales has a perspective on the objects placed upon it. It was simply processing. It had found the unaccounted entry. It was examining me. And then it did something that I had not anticipated, and that I cannot fully explain even now, having had time to consider it. It waited, not with the patience of a predator, that coiled, directional patience that contains within it the eventual explosion of pursuit, with the patience of a process that has paused for input. It had found the discrepancy. It had flagged it. It was now waiting for the discrepancy to be resolved through the proper channels. The proper channels. I turned back to my clipboard. My hands were shaking. I note this for the log, because accuracy requires that I note it. But they were shaking in the manner of hands that are cold, rather than in the manner of hands that have forgotten how to hold things, and that distinction seemed important. The proper channels. I could close the account. I understood this with a sudden, terrible clarity that arrived not as inspiration, but as procedure. The slow, grinding resolution of a complex reconciliation problem that my mind had been processing below the level of conscious thought for the past several hours. I could close the account. I had the delivery manifest. I had the outstanding resupply request. I had the authority, as Provost-Scribe Grade 7, to confirm delivery and file the confirmation through the administratum relay on the Ferris Litany. But delivery confirmation requires a receiving signature, a quartermaster's signature from a ranking officer of the receiving regiment, confirming that the delivered goods match the manifest in quantity and condition and have been accepted into the regiment's supply inventory. The quartermaster of the 701st Ossuar Fusiliers was dead at his desk with his pen on the floor. I could not use him. I thought about this carefully, with the auditor standing at the end of the corridor, waiting with its terrible procedural patience for me to resolve the discrepancy. I thought about it the way I think about any complex reconciliation, by returning to first principles, by going back to the regulation and reading it carefully, because regulations in 23 years have never once said exactly what I initially assumed they said. I reached into my document satchel. I keep, as a matter of professional practice, a complete set of blank Departamento Munitorum forms in my satchel at all times. Every standard form, in triplicate, sorted by number and cross-referenced in a small hand-indexed catalogue, I made myself during a particularly slow transit 8 years ago. Form 1 Alpha through Form 44 Omega, including near the back of the A section, the form I had never once used in 23 years of supply work, but had carried because the regulations required that I carry it. Form 1 Alpha, Emergency Personnel Attachment Notice, for use when a supply chain representative is required to temporarily assume receiving authority in the absence of a designated regimental quartermaster under the provisions of Munitorum General Order 7, Subclause 19, Emergency Quartermaster Provision 17 Kappa. I had carried this form for 23 years. I had thought of it, on the rare occasions I thought of it at all, as the form you carried because the regulations said you carried it. The way you carry a lumen on a sunny day, because the regulation says you carry it, because someone at some point wrote the regulation after a situation in which not carrying a lumen on a sunny day had resulted in a problem that cost more paperwork to fix than simply carrying the lumen would have cost in the first place. I pulled it out. The auditor had not moved. I looked at the form. I looked at my manifest. I looked at the dead commissar's log, open on my knee to the page where he had written, in his compressed cipher hand, "It will hold the account open until the accounting closes." I picked up my quill, and I began to fill out Form 1 Alpha, Emergency Personnel Attachment Notice. Attaching party, Haas, Aldric, Provost-Scribe Grade 7, Departamento Munitorum, Supply Division Tertius. Receiving unit, 701st Ossuar Fusiliers, designated non-operational. Attachment designation, Provisional Acting Quartermaster, Emergency authority. Effective date. One paused here. I looked at the stack of 11 future resupply requests on the shelf above me. I looked at the date on the first one. 8 days ago, the day the original request was submitted, 2 days before the regiment stopped. Effective date, retroactive to 8 days prior, the date of the original resupply submission. If I was the quartermaster from the date the request was filed, then I was the quartermaster when the request was outstanding, and I was here now, and I had the delivery. I could sign for it myself. I looked up at the auditor at the end of the corridor. It had not moved, but the hum, the long, patient, searching hum, had shifted again. It had a different quality now, still present, still watching. But there was something in it that I can only describe, inadequately and with full awareness of the inadequacy, as interest. It was reading what I was writing. It was watching me try to close the account through the proper channels. And it was, in its terrible, procedural, faceless way, waiting to see if the numbers would reconcile. I looked back down at the form. I wrote my name in the provisional quartermaster field. I pressed my official supply scribe stamp, the one I have carried for 11 years, the one that bears my grade designation and my division number, and the aquila above them both, worn slightly soft at the edges from 11 years of use, into the ink pad in my satchel. I pressed it to the form. I looked at the impression. It was correct. The stamp was correct. The form was correct. The logic was, it was something. It was the logic of a man who has spent 23 years inside a system and knows the system's tolerances better than the system knows itself. But there was still the delivery to formally receive, the manifest to close, the confirmation to file. I reached for my clipboard, and from beside me, for the first time since I had sat down beside her, Corporal Vess made a sound that was not the recitation of the regimental roster. She said, in a voice like a document that has been folded and unfolded too many times, thin at the creases, still legible but only just, "Are you on the manifest?" The hum rose. The earth beneath the duckboards pressed upward. I looked at her. Her eyes had left the north end of the corridor and had found me. Actually found me, with something behind them that was closer to recognition than anything I had seen in her since I discovered her in the alcove. She was not asking me a casual question. She was asking me the only question that mattered in this trench, on this planet, in the accounting of the thing at the end of the corridor that had the quality of figures learning to stand. Was I on the manifest? I looked down at Form 1 Alpha, my name in the provisional quartermaster field, my stamp in the authorization box, the retroactive effective date in the attachment field. I looked at Appendix 7 of my delivery manifest, the full personnel roster of the 701st Ossuar Fusiliers, and I found the last page, and at the bottom of the last page, in the empty space below the final enlisted name, I took my quill and I wrote, in the careful, abbreviated hand of a man who has been trained to compress information into small spaces, Haas, A. Provost-Scribe, Acting QM, attached per Form 1 Alpha, retroactive. I looked at what I had written. I was on the manifest. The duckboards beneath my feet groaned with the pressure of something rising, and from the north end of the corridor, the column of figures that had learned to stand upright took one slow, deliberate step toward me. Traveler of the Void. The fourth transmission is complete. Aldric Haas has been named the auditor. He has understood its nature. He has found the only possible solution, and he has begun to execute it. He is now on the manifest. Whether the manifest will be enough, whether the numbers will reconcile, whether an emergency attachment notice filed by a soft-handed supply clerk in a dead trench on a dying world will satisfy a 10,000-year-old entity of bureaucratic dread, That is the question that Chapter 5 will answer. The final chapter, filed in the proper order. The account will close, one way or another. Secure the Geller field, strike the seal, join the crew, strike the bell. Do not miss the ending. Chapter 5, filed in the proper order. I have, in 23 years, never improvised. I want that on the record before I describe what I did next. Because the record, when it is eventually reviewed, and it will be reviewed, everything is eventually reviewed. That is the one article of faith I hold with the conviction that other men hold their theology. Should reflect that improvisation was not a habit I had cultivated or a tendency I had indulged. It was a last resort. It was the action of a man who had exhausted the catalogue of standard responses and was standing in a dead trench with a live entity at the end of the corridor and a clipboard in his hands and the specific terrible clarity of a person who has just understood that the only tool available to him is the one he has been carrying for 23 years without ever needing to use it. The Form 1 Alpha, Emergency Personnel Attachment Notice. I had already filled in the fields. My name, my grade, my division. The receiving unit, 701st Ossuar Fusiliers, designated non-operational, a designation I had invented on the spot, and which I was reasonably confident existed nowhere in the Munitorum's official taxonomy of regimental statuses, but which was accurate in the way that all good clerical language is accurate. It described the situation without requiring the reader to confront the situation directly. Non-operational. Not dead. Non-operational. A regiment awaiting resources. A regiment whose function has been suspended pending resolution of an outstanding administrative matter. I had written my name in the provisional quartermaster field. I had pressed my stamp to the authorization box. I had written myself into Appendix 7 at the bottom of the last page, in the space below the final enlisted name, in the careful abbreviated hand I have used for 11,000 manifests. What remained was the delivery itself, the formal act of reception, the closing of the transaction that the auditor had been holding open for 6 days, through the deaths of 1,246 people, through the filing of 11 future resupply requests by a dead regiment that understood, in whatever way the dead understand things, that the accounting had to be kept current, that the forms had to be submitted, that the machine had to be fed, or the machine would not release them. I turned to the delivery manifest, my manifest, the one I had carried from Hive Verigor, triple-checked 11 times in transit, confirmed correct at 0900 hours this morning on the landing ramp of the Ferris Litany before I walked across 40 meters of grey-brown earth toward a trench full of the standing dead. I found the receiving confirmation section. Page 1, bottom third, below the cargo inventory and above the transport certification. Standard format, a table with 3 fields, delivered by my name and stamp. Already completed, because I am always the one who delivers. Received by blank. Date of receipt, blank. I filled in the date, the 14th of Secundus. Today. Correct. I filled in the received by field. Haas, A. Provost-Scribe Grade 7, acting as Provisional Quartermaster, 701st Ossuar Fusiliers. Perform 1 Alpha. Emergency attachment, authorized under Munitorum General Order 7, Subclause 19, Emergency Quartermaster Provision 17 Kappa. I pressed my stamp to the field, the stamp that bears my grade designation and my division number, and the aquila above them both, worn soft at the edges from 11 years of daily use, familiar as a handshake, as the weight of a pen, as the grandmother's cough of an old ship's engines in the dark. I was the delivering party. I was the receiving party. The transaction was complete. I held both documents, the delivery manifest and Form 1 Alpha, and I looked at them for a moment that the log records as 43 seconds, but which felt considerably longer, in the way that moments of irrevocable action always feel longer than they are. Because the mind is making a final inventory of the world, as it was before the action, knowing that the world after will be different and wanting, in some inarticulate way, to preserve the before. Then I picked up my lumen. I stood up from the ammunition crate. I walked to the document cache mounted on the alcove wall, a standard Munitorum issue document cache, a sealed metal box with the Aquila stamped on its face, and a locking bar secured with a simple tumbler mechanism. And I opened it. Inside, the regiment's filed copies of everything. Requisitions, transfer orders, battle reports, medici logs, duty rosters, disciplinary records, the accumulated paperwork of a regiment that had been doing things correctly for as long as it had existed. Doing things correctly right up until the end. Right up until the end, and in the form of 11 future resupply requests, some distance beyond it. I placed the completed delivery manifest in the cache. Both copies, the delivery copy and the receiving copy, because the receiving unit's copy goes in the receiving unit's document cache, and I was, per Form 1 Alpha, a member of the receiving unit. I placed Form 1 Alpha in the cache beside it. I closed the cache. I engaged the locking bar. I stood back, and I waited. The hum had been rising throughout the process of completing the forms, not rapidly, not with the urgency of a thing that is threatened and responding, but with the slow, inexorable pressure of a process approaching its conclusion, a sound that was building not toward a crescendo, but toward a result. The difference matters. A crescendo is dramatic. A result is simply the end of a calculation. The auditor had not moved from the north end of the corridor. It had taken one step when I wrote my name into Appendix 7. One step, slow and deliberate, in the manner of something that moves not because it needs to close distance, but because movement is one of the ways a process expresses progress. It had stopped when I began completing the delivery manifest. It had been still since, watching, processing, reading. I stood with my back to the document cache and my clipboard held in both hands across my chest. Not as a shield, I want to be clear about this. It is not a shield, a clipboard is not a shield, but as the natural posture of a man who holds a clipboard, the way other men hold the things that make them feel like themselves. And I looked at the auditor at the end of the corridor. I will record this precisely, and I will record it once, and then I will not record it again, because once is sufficient, and more than once begins to be something other than documentation. It was tall. It occupied the full height of the trench corridor, in the way that a column of text occupies the full height of a page, not by expanding to fill the space, but by existing in a quantity that naturally reached from floor to ceiling, without consideration of the space's dimensions. It was not entirely stable in its form. Its edges had the quality of a figure in an old picked capture that has been exposed slightly too long, present, recognizable as a shape, but with a soft indistinction at the boundaries where the shape negotiated with the surrounding air and neither fully won. It had no eyes. It had the place where eyes would be, and in that place was the attention I had felt in the hum from the moment I arrived in the trench, that focused procedural awareness, that quality of a process directed at a specific input. It was the attention of something that has been given a task and is performing it with complete fidelity to the parameters of the task, without cruelty, without mercy, without any of the human qualities that words like cruelty and mercy describe, because those qualities require a perspective that the auditor did not possess. It was examining the document cache. It was reading what I had filed. The hum held. 1 second. 5. 10. The amber half-light through the overhead cover of the corridor lay flat and directionless across everything. Across the duckboards and the earth walls, and the dead regiment standing at their posts in the firing trench above. Across Corporal Vess beside me, with her jaw finally still and her eyes finally closed, in something that might have been unconsciousness, or might have been the first uncontested sleep she had managed in 6 days. Across the document cache with its Aquila stamp and its locking bar, and the papers inside it that said, in the formal language of the Departamento Munitorum, that the account was settled. The hum began to change, not louder, not softer. The direction of it shifted, the way a sound shifts when its source moves, when the thing generating it turns away. The pressure in the earth beneath the duckboards changed its character, from the upward press of something rising to the downward recession of something returning. The quality of the attention, that focused procedural awareness that had been directed at me since I first walked into this trench and became an unaccounted entry in a ledger I had not known I was in, that quality withdrew. The column of figures at the end of the corridor was no longer there. It did not leave dramatically. It did not collapse or dissolve or retreat with any of the theatrical finality that the stories tell you to expect when a warp entity is defeated. It simply ceased to occupy the space it had been occupying, the way a process ends when it has returned its result, not with a conclusion, but with a completion. The task was done. The result was filed. The account was settled. The hum faded into the earth. The trench was silent, not the held breath silence of the past several hours, not the silence of a space that is being assessed, that is being counted, that is vibrating with the attention of something old and patient and implacable. The ordinary silence of an empty place. The silence of a room after the work is done, and the workers have gone home, and the only sounds left are the small mechanical sounds of materials settling, and the faint distant sounds of a world continuing to exist outside the walls. Corporal Vess made a sound, not words, a small involuntary exhalation, the kind the body produces when something that has been holding it releases its grip. The sound of a fist unclenching translated into breath. She slid sideways on the ammunition crate, and her shoulder met the earth wall, and she stayed there, propped at an angle, breathing with the deep unconscious rhythm of a person who has finally been allowed to stop performing the act of being present. She was alive. I checked. I pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point on her neck, the way the Medica manuals describe, because I have read the Medica manuals. I have read every manual that has ever been placed in my professional path, and her pulse was there, slow and steady and slightly too slow, the pulse of a body that has been running on something other than ordinary physiology for 6 days and is now taking stock of the deficit, but present, continuous, hers. She was going to live. Probably. I noted her condition in the log. I noted the cessation of the auditory phenomenon. I noted the time. I noted that the document cache had been secured and the forms filed per standard protocol. I noted that the delivery manifest had been signed and countersigned and placed in the appropriate file. I noted that the account was closed. Then I picked up Corporal Vess and I carried her out of the trench. She weighed less than I expected. This is not a heroic observation. I am a 54-year-old clerk, and the carrying of another person's body weight across the uneven terrain of a war zone trench and up a timber-framed entry cut and across 40 meters of grey-brown cratered earth is not an activity I was designed for or trained in. I managed it because I had to manage it, which is different from being capable of it, and because whatever the auditor had done to her over 6 days had taken something from her that had not yet been returned, and she was in consequence easier to carry than a living person of her size should have been. The amber half-light of Ossuar IV lay flat across the landing zone. The Ferris Litany sat where I had left her. Landing struts sunk slightly into the churned earth. The grandmother's cough audible from 30 meters. That deep, rhythmic throb of old engines that have been running long enough to develop their own character, their own particular complaint about the work. The cargo ramp was still down. The 86 pallets and 40 crates and 12 canisters and 16 amphorae were still in the hold, because there was no one in the dead regiment to take delivery of them, and I had not unloaded them, because the formal delivery, the closing of the account, the signing of the manifest, did not require the physical transfer of goods. The manifest said the goods had been delivered. The manifest was correct. The goods would remain in the hold. I carried Corporal Vess up the ramp and into the cargo bay, and I laid her on a folded tarpaulin between two pallet stacks, and I covered her with an emergency thermal sheet from the Medici kit mounted on the bulkhead, and I told Mistress Navigator Vaughan, when she came down from the command deck to investigate the sounds of my return, that we had a survivor and that we needed to break atmosphere as soon as the engines could be brought to readiness. Vaughan looked at Corporal Vess. She looked at me. She looked at the cargo hold, still fully loaded. She said, "The delivery." I said, "The delivery has been confirmed. The manifest is signed. The account is settled." She looked at me for a moment with the eyes of a woman who has been plying the stars for 30 years and has learned to distinguish between the face of a person who is telling her something straightforward and the face of a person who is telling her something straightforward that contains within it a depth of complexity that she has decided, as a matter of professional survival, not to investigate. She said, "I'll bring the engines up." She went back up to the command deck. I sat down in the cargo hold beside Corporal Vess, and I opened my log, and I began to write the supplementary field report. We broke the atmosphere on the evening of the 14th of Secundus. I filed the supplementary field report through the Ferris Litany's cogitator relay at 0300 hours the following morning, during the quiet of the night watch, when the rest of the crew slept, and the only sounds were the grandmother's cough and the faint cold silence of the void outside the hull. The report was thorough. I am always thorough. I documented the condition of the regiment on arrival. I documented the physical state of the personnel, the cessation pattern, the undisturbed defensive positions, the absence of external cause. I documented the outstanding resupply forms, all 12 of them, including the original, and I noted their dates. I documented the Commissar's cipher log and its contents, summarized accurately and without embellishment, because embellishment is not a clerical virtue, and the facts, in this case, required none. In subform 4B, field notation, exceptional circumstances, I noted that the regiment had been found non-operational on arrival, and that, in the absence of a designated receiving quartermaster, I had assumed provisional receiving authority per Munitorum General Order 7, Subclause 19, Emergency Quartermaster Provision 17 Kappa, and had signed for the delivery myself under Form 1 Alpha, a copy of which was attached as Appendix 12. I noted that the filed copies were in the regimental document cache at grid reference 44 North, trench line Kappa 7, Ossuar IV, in the storage alcove designated D4. I noted that one survivor had been recovered, Junior Quartermaster Corporal Vess, T, serial number attached, and was receiving care aboard the Ferris Litany, pending transfer to a Medici facility upon our return to Hive Verigor. I submitted the report. I made myself recaf from the stores, the dehydrated administratum standard grade, the same as the 40 crates still in the hold, and it tasted, as it always tastes, of warm nothing with ambitions. And I sat in the cogitator bay with the stars cold and unhurried outside the scratched viewport, and I permitted myself, for the first and only time in this entire affair, to feel something that was not procedural in its nature. I am not certain what it was. Relief has a specific flavor, the sudden lightening of a weight you had stopped noticing because you had been carrying it long enough that it felt like your own body. What I felt was not that. The weight was still present, the weight of the trench, of the count of 1,246 names ticked against a roster, of Corporal Vess's voice cycling through the dead, of the column of figures at the end of the corridor, and the step it took when I wrote my name into Appendix 7. The weight was still there. It had simply been joined by something else, something that I will record for the log as the particular exhaustion of a person who has done the correct thing by entirely incorrect means, and knows it and does not regret it, and cannot be certain that it was enough. I finished my recap. I went to sleep. 3 days later, as the Ferris Litany made final approach to Hive Verigor, and the Hive's upper spires resolved from smear to geometry in the viewport, the cogitator relay chimed. Automated response. Administratum Central, Segmentum Pacificus, Supply Verification Division. Processing time, 3 days, which is, I note, extremely fast for the Administratum, and which suggests that my report had triggered some form of priority flag, the nature of which I can only speculate about and choose not to. I opened the response. I read it. I read it again. The Administratum had reviewed my Form 1 Alpha, Emergency Personnel Attachment Notice, filed in connection with Delivery Manifest Reference Number, and here followed the 17-digit alphanumeric string that I had generated at the start of this delivery, and which I have memorized in the way you memorize anything you look at often enough. The form had been rejected. Emergency Quartermaster Provision 17. Kappa, the response noted in the flat, impersonal register of automated administratum correspondence. The register of a system so vast and so old that it has long since ceased to notice that the words it generates will be read by people, is applicable only in circumstances where the receiving regiment maintains a minimum operational strength of 200 surviving personnel. The 701st Ossuar Fusiliers, per my own field report, maintained 0 surviving personnel, Corporal Vess having been listed under my report as recovered rather than operational. 0 did not meet the threshold of 200. My attachment notice was therefore invalid. My receiving authority was therefore invalid. My signature on the delivery manifest was therefore uncertified. The delivery, per administratum notation, could not be confirmed. The account remained open. I set down the response. I looked at my manifest. I looked out the viewport at the hive spires of Hive Verigor, approaching through the upper atmosphere. Those vast towers of accumulated human habitation rising from the planetary surface like the fingers of a buried hand. Each one containing millions of souls, going about the business of being alive and accounted for, and mostly indifferent to the machinery that accounted for them. At the bottom of the automated response, below the rejection notation, and above the standard administratum closing invocation, in the Emperor's name, all accounts shall be settled, which I had always read as a comfort, and now read as something I did not have a word for, was a further notation. In accordance with standard resupply scheduling protocol, a new delivery order had been generated for the 701st Ossuar Fusiliers. 60 days from the date of the rejected confirmation. Standard cargo, 86 pallets of Grade 3 compressed corpse starch ration bricks, 40 crates of dehydrated recaf powder, 12 Medici supply canisters, 16 ceramic amphorae of distilled amasec, officer grade. Destination: Trench line Kappa 7, grid reference 44 North, Ossuar IV. Receiving contact: Quartermaster, 701st Ossuar Fusiliers. The machine had generated a new delivery order for a regiment it had been told was dead, to be delivered to a trench full of standing corpses, to be received by a quartermaster who did not exist. Because the account was open, because the form had been submitted, because the machine does not cross-reference the living against the listed. The machine only checks whether the form has been filled in correctly, whether the fields are complete, whether the stamp is present, whether the columns add up. The columns added up. 60 days from now, someone will receive this delivery order. Someone would load a hold. Someone would make warp transit to Ossuar IV. Someone would descend a landing ramp in the amber half-light of a dying war-zone world and walk 40 meters across grey-brown earth toward a trench line and see the helmets above the parapet and feel, perhaps, a flicker of something that they would mistake for professional reassurance. A disciplined regiment standing ready before they were close enough to see the faces. I thought about that person. I did not know who they were. I knew the system that would produce them. A shift roster somewhere in the Departamento Munitorum, a name drawn from a pool of available supply scribes, an assignment stamped and filed and transmitted without ceremony, because ceremony is not efficient and the machine is above all else efficient. I thought about them descending the ramp. I thought about the helmets. I thought about the hum, settled back into the earth of Ossuar IV, patient as paper, certain as a stamp, waiting for the account to close. Then I reached into my document satchel. I found Form 22 Omega, Administrative Decision Review, Standard Processing Time, 6 to 18 months. I had carried it for 11 years. I had used it twice. It is a long form, 4 pages of fields covering the grounds for appeal, the supporting documentation, the regulatory basis for the challenge, the requested resolution, and filling it out correctly requires patience and precision, and the particular kind of stubbornness that 23 years of supply work either builds or breaks. I placed it on the cogitator bay desk. I uncapped my quill. Outside the viewport, the hive spires of Verigor turned slowly as the Ferris Litany made her final approach. The grandmother's cough deep and steady in the hull beneath me. The stars retreating behind the amber smear of the upper atmosphere. The void closing over behind us like a document being filed. I began, very carefully, to write. In the field marked Grounds for Appeal, I wrote, "The rejection of Form 1 Alpha under Emergency Quartermaster Provision 17 Kappa on the basis of insufficient surviving personnel represents a misapplication of the provision's intent. General Order 7, Subclause 19, was designed to ensure that supply chains are not disrupted by the incidental unavailability of designated receiving officers. The spirit of the provision is the continuity of the accounting. The accounting was continued. The account was settled. The rejection of the settling instrument on technical grounds reopens an account that was closed in good faith through proper procedural channels at significant personal." I paused. I crossed out significant personal. That is not clerical language. That is not the language of a Form 22 Omega. I wrote instead, "At considerable logistical cost." Better. I continued writing. I would write until the form was complete. I would submit it through the proper channels. The processing time was 6 to 18 months. I was patient. I am always patient. I am a Provost-Scribe, Grade 7, Departamento Munitorum, and patience is not a virtue in my profession. It is a job requirement, like carrying the lumen on a sunny day, like filing in triplicate, like keeping the voice log running during active planetary delivery operations. Somewhere on Ossuar IV, in the earth beneath the duckboards of trench line Kappa 7, something old and patient and made of figures hummed its slow arithmetic. Somewhere in the administratum, a delivery order for the 701st Ossuar Fusiliers was working its way through the processing queue. Somewhere in the Medici facility at High Verigor, Corporal Vess would be admitted to care, and someone would process her intake forms and note her regimental designation, and note that the 701st Ossuar Fusiliers was listed in the current supply schedule as an active status regiment, and file her accordingly. The machine does not issue corrections. The machine issues reminders, and somewhere, 60 days from now, on a world whose name I did not yet know, a supply scribe was going about the ordinary work of being a supply scribe, checking manifests, counting crates, ticking names against rosters, without any knowledge of what was waiting for them, without any knowledge that the delivery they were about to be assigned had been assigned before, that the account it was meant to close had been opened before, that the trench at grid reference 44 North was full of a regiment that had been standing at its posts for 60 days, more than it had already been standing. Patient, in order, waiting for the accounting to close. I bent my head over Form 22 Omega. I wrote. The grandmother's cough churned beneath me. The stars were cold. The file was open. The account was outstanding. The manifest was correct. It was always correct. That was never the problem. Magos Arithmetica, Sevin Drell, Form 22. Omega, Appeal Reference Haas, a 7741, was submitted to Administratum Central, Segmentum Pacificus, on the date indicated. Standard processing time, 6 to 18 months. Current status, pending. The delivery order for the 701st Ossuar Fusiliers, 60-day cycle, was fulfilled by Provost-Scribe Maret Undine, Grade 5, aboard the Munitorum Freighter Correct Measure. Scribe Undine's voice log was not recovered. The correct measure has not returned to High Verigor. The account remains open. Traveler of the Void, you have reached the end. Aldric Haas filed his paperwork. He closed the account through the only means available to him. He carried Corporal Vess out of the trench. He wrote his appeal. He bent his head, and he did the work, the way he had always done the work. Because that is what he is, and 23 years do not stop being 23 years simply because the world has turned strange. The Administratum rejected him. The machine generated a new order, and Provost-Scribe Maret Undine, Grade 5, went to Ossuar 460 days later, and did not come back. The account is outstanding. The file is open. The manifest is always correct. That was never the problem. If this chronicle found you, if the dread has settled somewhere permanent, somewhere it will still be sitting when you wake at 3 in the morning and hear, for just a moment, the sound of something counting. Then do this. Secure the Geller field. Strike the seal of approval upon this chronicle so the Emperor may witness it. Join the crew of Voidborn Terrors by subscribing to this archive. Strike the bell of notification so the next transmission reaches you before the silence does. We will be back. We always come back. The delivery schedule demands it. Voidborn Terrors. The Void remembers. The machine never forgets.